The baby was 9 months old when I noticed my milk had started to thin. I remember standing at the bathroom sink in the gray hour before the rooster's call, the house silent except for the drip of the faucet I hadn't fixed yet, listening to her fuss at my chest and pull away unsatisfied. My body was tired in a way that had no bottom to it. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, something that had been collecting since her birth. Since the birth before that, since the first winter of my marriage, when I understood for the first time that my body belonged to more people than just myself, I stood at that sink, and the thought arrived whole, the way true thoughts sometimes do. I think I am finished. And before I had said it to a single soul, before I had even let myself sit with it, fear moved in behind it. Not fear that she would go hungry. Fear of what my husband would say when I told him. Fear of what the church would think if they knew I'd even considered it. Fear of which parts of my own life were mine to decide, and which parts had never been. My name is Verna. I was raised old order Amish in a small settlement in northern Indiana. The kind of community where everyone's buggy and everyone's bonnet and everyone's garden looked close enough to the same that an outsider driving past wouldn't know one family from another. I left that life 7 years ago, and I am still, even now, finding language for things that happened to me inside it. This channel is where I put that language into words. If any part of what I'm about to tell you lands somewhere true for you, I'd be glad if you'd subscribe. Leave the video a like and tell me in the comments if any of this sounds familiar to your own life, plain or not. Here is something most people outside a community like mine never think to ask. How long does a woman nurse, and who decides when she's done? Let me tell you what nursing actually meant where I grew up. Not the gentle version people imagine, the real one. In our district, nursing was never written into any rule. The Ordnung, the unwritten code that governed the width of a hem, the cut of a beard, the size of a window, never said a single word about how long a mother fed her child. It didn't need to. The silence around a woman's body did all the saying that was required. You nursed because formula belonged to the English world, and the English world was vanity. And vanity was something you'd spend a lifetime training out of yourself. You nursed because your mother had nursed, because the minister's wife had nursed, because every woman you ever stood beside at a quilting was a woman who had nursed, and you had never once heard, in all your years inside that life, that there might be another way to feed a baby. And you nursed for exactly as long as your husband believed you should. That part, the part about whose decision it actually was, took me years of distance to see plainly. It wasn't only the community deciding. It was the man sitting across the supper table from you. In my house, that man was Aaron. Aaron was not a cruel man in the way the word usually gets used. He never raised a hand. He never raised his voice. What he did was quieter and harder to point to, and for that reason, harder to leave. He held opinions about my body the same calm way he held opinions about which field to rotate into clover, as plain fact, not up for debate, so that disagreeing with him felt less like disagreement and more like confusion on my part. Without ever once discussing it with me, he had decided that each of our children would nurse for a full year, minimum. I didn't learn this in a conversation. I learned it the way you learn the rules of a house, by accidentally breaking one. Our first baby nursed for 13 months. My body came back from it fine. We moved forward, and I thought nothing more of it because I had nothing yet to measure it against. Our second baby was harder from the start. The birth had torn something in me that took longer to mend. By 7 months, I was thinner than I had any business being. I was up every 2 hours through the night with her. I had a toddler climbing the porch steps and a husband who came in from the fields expecting a hot supper, and a wife who was steady, capable, and uncomplaining. At 8 months, I told Aaron I thought my body needed to be done. He looked at me the way he looked at a field that wouldn't cooperate with the weather. Patient, sure of himself. Like what I'd said was simply a small misunderstanding he could clear up. He said, "She'll need at least 4 more months." I said I didn't know if I had 4 more months in me. He said, "You'll pray on it." That was the whole conversation. Not because he slammed a door or spoke sharply, because in our world, once a husband had answered, the matter was closed. You didn't reopen it. You prayed on it, which meant you accepted it, which meant you found a way to live inside it. I want you to sit with that moment for a second because, From the outside, it's easy to ask why I didn't just stop on my own, why I didn't simply make a different choice. The truth isn't that I lacked the will. The truth is that I had been raised from the cradle to understand my body's limits as a spiritual failing rather than a medical reality. That discomfort wasn't a reason. That my needs weren't a reason. That a good wife yielded, and yielding was its own kind of holiness, and wanting something different for myself was the same as wanting to be less of a Christian than God intended. I didn't have the word boundary. I didn't have the word consent. I had the word patience, and I held it over everything that was leaking through, the way you'd hold a tarp over a roof you knew was failing. I nursed those 4 extra months, 11 months in total for her. My body did what I'd asked of it because I asked out of desperation, not out of choice. When I finally weaned her, the relief that came over me was so large it actually frightened me. It wasn't joy, it was relief. The kind that tells you, after the fact, that something had been genuinely wrong, even while you'd spent months convincing yourself it was fine. My neighbor Mary stopped nursing her third baby at 4 months. Her body had simply quit producing. There was nothing left to give. She told me about it in a near whisper while the two of us hung wash side by side on her line, talking toward the wet sheets instead of toward each other, so no passerby could read her mouth moving. She said her husband hadn't spoken to her for 3 full days afterward. 3 days of silence in a house where silence was already most of the conversation. 3 days of suppers eaten without a single glance crossing the table. 3 days of a man telling his wife, without a syllable, that she had failed at something she owed him. She told me that on the evening of the third day, she'd stood in her own kitchen and apologized to him for stopping too soon. I asked her what exactly she'd apologized for. She looked at the sheet in front of her for a long while before she answered, and said she honestly didn't know, only that the silence had to end somehow, and that was the only door she knew how to open. That's the part people outside this world rarely understand about control like that. It doesn't need rules written anywhere. It doesn't need anyone to enforce them. It lives entirely in the silence, in the withdrawal, in 3 days of cold that teach a woman her body's limits are a transgression that's hers alone to repair. Nobody needs to put a lock on a door once the woman inside it has already learned to guard it herself. By my third baby, something in me had shifted in a way I still find hard to put into plain sentences. I was 23. I'd been married 7 years by then. I'd watched Mary apologize for a body that had simply run dry through no fault of her own. I had nursed 2 children well past the point of my own exhaustion. And somewhere inside me, something had gone very quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that settles in once a person has gone unheard for so long, they stop expecting anyone to hear them at all. I nursed our third child for 2.5 months. After that, my body stopped producing anything that mattered. It wasn't a decision I made. It was simply a fact, the way a well goes dry, whether you wanted it to or not. I didn't tell Aaron when it happened. I told him days later, after I'd already started supplementing in secret. That's the kind of hiding a woman does, not out of dishonesty, but out of survival. The same way Mary had learned to talk to a clothesline instead of a husband. When I finally told him, his expression barely moved. He said, "You should have told me when it happened." I said, "I'm telling you now." He said, "There's a difference between a wife telling her husband something as it happens and a wife telling him after she's already decided it on her own." And there it was. One sentence holding the entire architecture of our marriage inside it. Not my body, not my milk or my exhaustion, or the 2.5 months I had already tried. What mattered to him was that every decision about my own body had to pass through his permission first in order to be real. I'd like to tell you I argued. I didn't. I said something small and apologetic and went back to setting the table. The house kept running because the house always had to keep running. When I left at 26, the shunning came fast and complete. Mail returned unopened. Phone calls that simply rang and rang. The one time I managed to reach my mother, her voice was careful and far away. The voice you use with someone who has chosen a path that can't be unchosen. My children were small. Leaving cost exactly what everyone warned me it would cost, and I paid every bit of it and kept walking anyway. In therapy, years later, I finally found the words for what those 3 days of silence had actually been. I found the word for what it means when a person needs someone else's permission just to access their own body. I learned that what I had spent years calling patience actually had a different name, and that naming it correctly didn't make me weak. It made me honest for the first time in a long time. What I hope you take from this, if you've stayed with me this far, isn't that the men in my old life were monsters. Aaron wasn't a monster. He was a man raised inside a system that had taught him from boyhood that his wife's body was something the household shared. And he believed that the same uncomplicated way you believe anything you've never once been given a reason to question. If there's a villain anywhere in this story, it's the silence itself. The system that hands a woman no real information about her own body, no permission to name her own limits, no vocabulary for what she actually needs, and then calls her exhaustion a failure of her faith. The system that teaches a husband his certainty is leadership and teaches his wife that her depletion is simply a test she hasn't passed yet. The system where Mary stands at a clothesline apologizing for a well that had nothing left to give. I wasn't too young back then to nurse 3 children. I was too young to know I was allowed to say, plainly and without guilt, this is what my body can give. And past this point isn't holiness anymore. It's harm. I grieve for the woman standing at that bathroom sink in the dark, afraid of a thought she hadn't even said aloud yet. I grieve for Mary at the clothesline, talking to wet sheets because she couldn't talk to a person. I grieve for every woman who was handed endurance instead of information and told the two were the same thing. If you grew up somewhere your body's limits were always someone else's decision to make, I see you. If you were taught that suffering in silence was the same thing as trusting God, I see you too. Your body was never a debt owed to anyone. It was never a farm to be managed for someone else's benefit. It was yours. It always was, even on the days they made you believe otherwise. And if any of this is the first time you've said even a small piece of your own story out loud, even just typed quietly into a comment below, where no one in your old life will ever see it, that counts for something. It might be the start of the same thing it was for me.